Hey, good morning, everyone. Happy Tuesday morning to you. Welcome back to Morning Musings. Hey, listen, before I get into the conclusion of our examination of Isaiah chapter 59 as it relates to the taking away of Israel's sin and the return of the absent master, I want to point out to you that thanks to the good work of Daniel Rogers and Alan Morton, my webmaster, we are now taking the audio from Two Guys in a Bible, which airs every Tuesday night at 6 o'clock Central Time, p.m., obviously, and we're going to post them on YouTube. So that means that you can access that. Just go to YouTube, and you'll get the audio there, absolutely free of charge. So the Two Guys in a Bible on Fulfilled Radio that airs every Tuesday night at 6 o'clock Central Time will now be on YouTube. Daniel has already posted a whole bunch of those programs in which we've been discussing the Messianic Temple, pardon me, which is a fantastic and deep subject. And the response to those videos, or audios, has already been wonderful. So I thank you for listening and tuning in. So please continue to do that. All right. Yesterday, I set the stage. I pointed out the following. Matthew chapter 25:14 is the return of the absent master. Virtually everyone agrees that Matthew 25:14 is about the, quote, second coming of Christ. It is the return of Christ after his departure of Acts chapter 1, for instance. But the return of Christ of Acts 1 and Matthew 25:14 and following would be at the time of the resurrection. 1 Corinthians 15. The time of the resurrection is, however, guess what? The time of the putting away of sin. But the time of the putting away of sin, according to Daniel 9:24, is confined to the 70 weeks of Daniel chapter 9. The 70 weeks of Daniel chapter 9 are confined to the time consummating in the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. Therefore, the time of the putting away of sin of Romans 11:26 and 27. The time of the putting away of sin at the time of the resurrection of 1 Corinthians 15. The time of the putting away of sin at the return of the absent master of Acts 1 and Matthew 25:14 would be at the time of the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. I'm sorry, folks, you just simply cannot separate the time of the putting away of sin from the time of Daniel chapter 9. Now let's drive this home by looking once again, mostly in review, of what I shared with you yesterday from Isaiah 59. Isaiah 59 breaks itself down, again, a little bit of repetition, but that's okay. Breaks itself down in accusation. 3 times in verses 1 through 7 and 8, Yahweh accused Israel of being guilty of shedding innocent blood. Now I want to stop right there. Was Israel guilty of shedding innocent blood at different times in her history? Well, of course she was. In the book of Jeremiah chapter 2, chapter 7, chapter 22, other chapters as well, the Lord accused Israel of being guilty of shedding the blood of orphans and widows and of the innocent. So there's no question whatsoever about Israel being guilty of shedding innocent blood at different times in her history. She was guilty of shedding innocent blood during the time of the 10 northern tribes, which led to their destruction. So this is a constant theme. This is a continuing theme with Israel. However, since Paul is quoting Romans chapter 11, is quoting from Isaiah 59 in Romans 11 and applying it to his day and his time, that means that Isaiah 59 is not predictive of the Assyrian captivity, is not predictive of the Judean catastrophe in 586 BC. It means that it applied to the first century. So the accusation, and this is compounded and driven home by the following. This idea, number one, the accusation, you're guilty of shedding innocent blood. Isaiah 59, 1 through 7 and 8. Acknowledgement. Israel acknowledged in verse 6 and following that they were guilty of that and their sins mounted up to heaven. Listen, folks, that's filling the measure of sin. Now, did Israel fill up the measure of her sin, for instance, even in the time of Antiochus Epiphanes? Well, Daniel 8:23 says they did. But guess what? Jesus posited the filling up the measure of sin for his generation in the killing of his apostles and prophets and him, leading to the catastrophe of AD 70. So this recurring theme finds its consummate fulfillment in AD 70 when Israel, I use that term in its broadest application, was obliterated, totally destroyed in the overwhelming flood of destruction of Isaiah 59. So once again, Isaiah 59 is not talking about the 10 northern tribes. It's not talking about the 2 southern tribes. It is talking about Israel filling up the measure of her sin in that generation of the first century. Matthew 23, and Jesus is teaching on the filling up of the measure. Now watch this. Jesus said that Israel would fill up the measure of their fathers' guilt. You see, as Loophole taught concerning Isaiah chapter 65 and the filling up of the measure of sin foretold there, Loophole in his Bible commentary on the book of Isaiah, he said Isaiah chapter 65, 6 and following proves that there is such a thing as an accumulative guilt. And the reference to your fathers and filling up the measure of the father's guilt of Matthew 23 and Isaiah 59 tells us that, once again, the filling up the measure of sin of Isaiah 59 did not refer to the time of the Assyrian sin, did not refer to the Judean situation. It referred to Jesus' generation when he said, to the Jews, fill up then the measure of your father's guilt. Thus, anyone that would argue, well, Israel filled up the measure of their sin and was destroyed by the Assyrians, therefore that's what Isaiah is about. Sorry, that doesn't fit the bill in Matthew 23. Anyone that would say, well, okay, Judah was guilty of shedding innocent blood. They filled up the measure of their sin in that day and in that time. And the Lord came at that time, Ezekiel 7, Ezekiel 12. Well, they did fill up the measure of their sin in that generation, but they did not fill up the measure of their father's sin, and that's what is at stake. In Isaiah 59, Isaiah 65, Matthew 23. It is that filling up of the measure of the father's guilt that is the key interpretive principle here. And then, when Isaiah foretold, Yahweh foretold through Isaiah, that he was going to come and he was going to bring salvation. He was going to bring, did you notice it? Did you notice the reference here in verse 16 of Isaiah 59? He saw that there was no man, wondered that there was no intercessor. Therefore his own arm brought salvation for him, and his own righteousness, it sustained him. What did Daniel 9 predict? the bringing in of everlasting righteousness. Here is the coming of the Lord in Isaiah 59 for what purpose? To bring righteousness to bear, to bring salvation to bear. And it would be at the time when the Lord said, according to their deeds, accordingly I will repay, says the Lord. Recompense to his enemies and the coastlands he will fully repay. The Redeemer will come out of Zion, and to those who turn from transgression in Jacob. You see, this is the salvation of the remnant. This is Romans chapter 9 through 11. And the salvation of the remnant, which Romans 9:28 said, would be accomplished in a short time. It would not be protracted. It would not be delayed. It would be fulfilled shortly. In fact, the terminology of Romans 9:28 is very explicit. And again, as for me, says the Lord, this is my covenant with them when I take away their sin. So here is Paul in Romans chapter 11 predicting the fulfillment of Isaiah 59. Isaiah 59 would be fulfilled at the coming of the Lord in judgment of Israel for shedding innocent blood. That means Isaiah 59 and the coming of the Lord, and that means Romans chapter 11 and its prediction of the coming of the Lord out of Zion, in fulfillment of Isaiah 59:26. Verse 20. Is not a reference to the cross. It is not a reference to the incarnation of Christ. It is a reference to his coming in judgment, in retribution, in destruction, as well as salvation to bring in everlasting righteousness, fulfilling Daniel 9. But wait a minute. Daniel 9 said the bringing in of everlasting righteousness. Daniel said the time of the putting away of sin, which is Romans 11:27, which is Isaiah 59:20 and 21, would be confined to the 70 weeks. Now, since Isaiah 59 posits that at the time of the judgment, then since Daniel chapter 9 posits the destruction of Jerusalem, i.e. the judgment, that means that the 70 weeks includes the coming of the Lord in judgment, in righteousness, to take away sin at the time of the judgment of Jerusalem in AD 70. And guess what? That means Matthew 25:14, which is the return of the absent master, which is the coming of the Redeemer out of Zion to take away sin, was in AD 70, and the Olivet Discourse cannot be divided. Now, on tomorrow's program, I'm going to share with you why Daniel chapter 9, when it says 70 weeks are determined upon your city, why the destruction of the city lies within the 70 weeks, not outside, as men like Kenneth Gentry, Gary DeMar, even some amillennialists do as well teach. I'm sorry, that will not work. So I'll see you on the flip side.